with our technical difficulties, I am here to talk about content, context, users, and inclusive design for World Information Architecture Day. I do have a bad habit of speaking pretty quickly, but you will get the slides. I will put them on my website once I solve those technical difficulties. So I'll start with an introduction, tell you a little bit about me and why I'm here. I'll briefly go over some key terms: digital accessibility, inclusive design, and universal design. I'll spend about 10 minutes on the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, or the WCAG, which are the de facto industry standard. And I will also explain the POUR model, P-O-U-R, which stands for perceivable, operable, understandable, and robust. I'll then transition into talking about information architecture framework, content, context, and users, and how those terms map to inclusive design. Finally, I will wrap things up and then take questions. I am kind of an old-fashioned presenter, so I will ask that you save your questions for the end. And I'm going to remember to set a timer so I don't go too long. A couple disclaimers before we begin. Yes, as I'm sure you either know or can easily find out, I work for KeyBank up in Cleveland. The lawyers make me say I do not in any way represent the company. I'm only representing myself. Speaking of legal, there's some legal aspects to accessibility and inclusive design, particularly around the Americans with Disabilities Act, the ADA, or Section 508. I have a general understanding of the law. I cannot give legal advice. Finally, this is an informational presentation, not a how-to. So if you want to know how to solve accessibility problems, that's a different presentation. Who am I? Why am I here? This is a famous phrase, or maybe an infamous phrase if you prefer. Does anybody in the audience remember who infamously said this?
Admiral Stockdale.
There you go, Admiral James Stockdale. He was the vice presidential running mate for H. Ross Perot, the third-party candidate back in 1992. And he opened the vice presidential debate with this immortal phrase: who am I? Why am I here? It became something of a meme before we had memes. So who am I really? I'm Joshua Randall. I'm a user experience designer and user researcher at KeyBank. I appointed myself accessibility champion because nobody else wanted the job. I have a bachelor's degree in philosophy, which goes to show you never know where your career will take you. And I have a master's degree in user experience design from this fine institution. I just graduated in December 2018, so I'm very happy to be here speaking to you now. I've worked as an IT business analyst for 20 years, mostly at big Cleveland companies: Progressive, American Greetings, Medical Mutual, Sherwin-Williams, and now KeyBank. Although at KeyBank, I am now in the UX department. I've made that career transition. I started getting interested in UX about 5 years ago, and I started attending a lot of events like this one, World Usability Day. I joined as a member of User Experience Professionals Association, and I'm now on the board. So I strongly encourage anyone who's interested, do that networking and go to those meetups and events. It really does matter. My focus on digital accessibility is a little over a year old, starting when I was at Sherwin-Williams and continuing at KeyBank. Why am I here? I'm here because several months ago, while I was sitting in a hotel room at a conference in Las Vegas, I started rereading the book Information Architecture for the Web and Beyond, otherwise known as the Polar Bear book for obvious reasons. As I read the first few chapters, I was struck by the overlap between information architecture and inclusive design. I started drawing pictures and boxes and arrows, and pretty soon my paper looked like the stereotypical crazy conspiracy theory that you see in TV and movies. This is just a glimpse of what it was. Come back to that later. So let's review. Why am I here? I was at the most exciting city in the world, or one of them, and then I was rereading a textbook? What could be the explanation for this behavior? Well, we're all a little nerdy to be here on a Saturday to discuss information architecture. Thank you for coming to this conference. Thank you for coming to this session. Let's dive in. I want to go over some terms because the way I see it, inclusive design fits into accessibility broadly defined. I mentioned some of the legal apparatus that we have, the Americans with Disabilities Act, or Section 508 of the Rehabilitation Act, which applies to federal government agencies and those who do business. So these are specific, narrow regulations that you have to follow. Take a broader view, you start talking about web accessibility, making the web more usable by people with different abilities. Take a broader view than that, you're talking about digital accessibility, expanding beyond the web to other electronic documents, mobile apps, and so on. Take an even broader view and you get to inclusive design, which is considering the range of human diversity when creating designs. And perhaps the broadest view of all is something called universal design, which is the design of products and environments to be usable by all people to the greatest extent possible without the need for adaptation or specialized design. Universal design comes out of real-world, physical world architecture, but some of its ideas apply really nicely to web design. I'm going to try and stay in this kind of inclusive design sweet spot in this presentation. But I do want to also look at the definition of digital accessibility, and here's the official definition from the Web Accessibility Institute, or Web Accessibility Initiative, I should say. So, the ability of a website, mobile application, or electronic document to be easily navigated and understood by a wide range of users, including those who have visual, auditory, motor, or cognitive disabilities. So again, it's a superset of web accessibility. You're taking it beyond just websites to include mobile apps and things like PDFs or PowerPoint presentations. And notice the phrase, a wide range of users, and we'll keep that in mind when we talk about information architecture. Here's a couple of definitions of inclusive design. The first is from the Inclusive Design Research Center at the Ontario College of Art and Design, or OCADU. And you can see that it's more broad than digital accessibility. The second definition is from the website inclusivedesign.org, which is a product of the Paciello Group, one of the leading accessibility consulting firms. And I really want to focus in on this concept of permanent, temporary, and situational disabilities. We'll come back to that in a few moments. The Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. We have these because when we want to act on the idea of inclusive design and digital accessibility, we need something concrete to refer to. So the WCAG, as they're often referred to, are a set of principles, guidelines, and success criteria established by the World Wide Web Consortium. That's the same group that puts out standards like HTML, which is obviously what underlies the web. And the WCAG have become the industry standard for web accessibility. Now, they had been on version 2.0 since 2008, and in June of 2018, they went to version 2.1 to address some gaps around mobile technology, which, after all, barely existed in 2008, low vision, and cognitive disabilities. There's 4 principles at the top of the WCAG: perceivable, operable, understandable, and robust. Those form the mnemonic POUR, P-O-U-R. Those 4 principles break down into 13 guidelines that are numbered with digits like 1.1 and 1.2 and so on. The guidelines then further break down into detailed success criteria, and those would have 3 digits like 1.1.1 or 4.1.2. I'm going to stay at the top level, the principle level, the POUR mnemonic: perceivable, operable, understandable, and robust. Again, I have other presentations that go into the lower levels of detail. So let's talk about those principles in a little bit more depth. Perceivable. It means that people can perceive the information and the user interface components regardless of what senses they have or don't have. Or to put this another way, perceivable means we make our information available to many different senses, including hearing and touch. Operable. It means that people can act on the interface components. They can navigate the information space, they can explore it, and they can transact on it. We give people multiple ways to determine where they are, and to get to where they're going, and to find content once they arrive. Understandable means just what it says. That people can understand the information being presented. It means we write using plain language, and we apply consistent structure to what we write. Robust means that people can continue to access our content even when the underlying technology changes, as we know it will. 15 years ago, nobody had a smartphone. 10 years ago, nobody was talking to Siri or Alexa. 5 years ago, nobody had a smart watch. But by adhering to standards like HTML and WCAG, we can bake in forwards compatibility for future technologies, whatever they may be. When we look at the words that the Web Accessibility Initiative uses to describe the POUR principles, we find information, navigation, and content. And those are all words that are obviously also important to the field of information architecture. So speaking of information architecture, here is the information architecture framework from the Polar Bear book. It's your very classic Venn diagram of overlapping circles. This is on page 32 of the 4th edition if you want to follow along at home. So we'll talk about them kind of from left to right: content, context, and users. So the content, the information itself, and its presentation are essential to our ability to understand the stuff that's on the website or in the app. Context. Now, the diagram in the Polar Bear book and the words on this Venn diagram here refer to the business context in which information architecture operates. And at first I thought I was going to have to shoehorn context into inclusive design. But if you read the text that goes with the diagram, so it's on page 35 for those playing at home, this is kind of a lengthy quote, but bear with me here. You also need to understand the contextual differences imposed by the channels that the user will be using to interact with your organization. Will they be experiencing your services primarily via apps or mobile phones, or via a website in a desktop-based browser? Both platforms have things they can do well and things they can't. For example, smaller screens mean less space, which in turn implies shorter labels and navigation menus. Devices with small screens are also used at different times and places than those with larger screens. End quote. So that paragraph points us toward context of use and the constraints of technology, which are going to fit very nicely with inclusive design, as we will see. And finally, users. We've got the words audience and experience, which are essential elements of design in general and inclusive design in particular. Only by understanding the people who use our products can we build an effective information architecture for them. So I titled this talk Content, Context, Users, and Inclusive Design, but I actually want to tackle it in reverse order, starting with users. So it'll be users, context, content, and inclusive design. So we're going to talk about our audience, and with an eye towards inclusive design, we will talk about how many people have disabilities and why we should care. We'll talk about context of use and how situational disabilities affect all of us. We'll also talk about how stress is a part of our context. And we'll talk about content and how it's still the king, and why structure is so important to inclusive design. Let's start with users. 15.3% of people in the United States have an impairment that can affect their ability to use digital products. Don't just think about visually impaired people when you think about accessibility. People with difficulty grasping objects might have difficulty using a mouse or a touch screen. People with cognitive difficulties like attention deficit disorder or dyslexia may have difficulty understanding content without strong information architecture behind it or strong structure. The worldwide percentage is similar, 15% of people or over 1 billion people. We tend to focus on our customers who are affected by disabilities, but don't forget your employees as well. Almost everything we do in the workplace now has a digital component to it. We need to make that accessible so people can contribute. There's a self-interested reason to care about accessibility. Bruce Tognazzini, who's a former Apple designer and now at Nielsen Norman Group, writes, "We will all have disabilities eventually unless we die first." That's a morbid way to put it, but he's absolutely right. The aging population is increasingly using the internet. We need to design for them and for our future selves. Finally, beyond permanent disabilities, there's temporary and situational disabilities as well. But before we talk about those, let me ask a big question. Why should we care? Well, it's the right thing to do. Okay, maybe that's not compelling enough. Accessibility improves your brand. People's opinions can be shared openly, freely, and vastly. If your organization is doing right by its customers, that will bubble up, and vice versa. If people have a bad experience, like they can't add items to a shopping cart, they will tweet about it. But maybe only after they abandon a site. A survey in the United Kingdom found that 71% of customers with disabilities will click away from a website that's difficult to use, never to return. Accessibility is a quality of work issue. You've heard the phrase, whatever is worth doing at all is worth doing well. I think that applies to digital work just as much as it does to physical labor. And accessibility is usability. If up to 15% of people can't use something because you didn't take accessibility into account, then arguably you're not doing it well. Accessibility affects your business-to-business work. Many clients, especially government contractors or government agencies themselves, have accessibility requirements. And if you lack accessibility, you could become less competitive, you might not even get the bid. Some clients will require something called a VPAT, a voluntary product accessibility template. If you don't fill one out, or you fill it out and you have too many negative marks on it, you simply won't get the business. Accessibility helps with search engine optimization, or SEO. David Berman, who's an accessibility expert, writes that the most frequent visitor to your website is blind, deaf, and has the cognitive abilities of a 4-year-old. He's referring to the Google spider that indexes sites. It can't see, it can't hear, and it's not very bright. But the Google spider loves accessibility, and Google's SEO guidelines closely match the web accessibility guidelines. For example, you should put an HTML title element that is short and unique on every web page. This will help your SEO and will also help people using screen readers or other assistive technologies. Accessibility supports low bandwidth users. So we're sitting here in this high bandwidth environment, and it's easy to imagine that everywhere is like this. But the reality is that in the United States, 64% of people lack fast broadband. I think the worldwide percentage is something like 80% lack fast broadband. People who experience a slow site or one with a complex process, 75% of those people will no longer buy from that site if it's an e-commerce site. Now the good news is that the same updates that make a site more accessible for people with disabilities also make it more usable for people on low bandwidth connections. And finally, accessibility reduces legal risk. The Americans with Disabilities Act, the ADA, has been pretty consistently interpreted by the courts to apply to websites, not just physical buildings. There have been thousands of website-related cases brought under the ADA, and the trend has been increasing exponentially. The cost of an accessibility lawsuit can be high. In 2008, Target settled with the National Federation of the Blind for $6 million in damages and $4 million in legal fees. In April of 2018, Morgan Stanley was sued, and the plaintiff is asking for $9 million. And on January 3rd of 2019, a plaintiff brought a class action lawsuit against the website of the singer Beyonce, alleging that it's inaccessible to people with visual impairments. The plaintiff is seeking both an injunction to force the website to be updated and monetary damages to compensate the class members. So there you have a variety of reasons to care about accessibility, from the most high-minded to the most legalistic. Let's come back to that second part of the IA framework, context. This is a chart from Microsoft's Inclusive Design Toolkit. It shows different modes of perception: touch, see, hear, and speak, or different modes of perception and interaction, I should say. And it illustrates that you can have a permanent, temporary, or situational disability affecting each of these modes. For example, if you have a permanent disability with seeing, you may be blind. If you have a temporary disability with seeing, you may have cataracts. If you have a situational disability with seeing, you may be a distracted driver, or what I think is a better example, you're in bright sunlight trying to read your smartphone screen. Another example, if you have a permanent disability with hearing, you may be deaf. A temporary disability with hearing might be because you have an ear infection, and a situational disability could be because you're a bartender in a loud bar, or you just need to keep your volume down. Both of these situational disabilities involve someone's context of use, where they are and what the environment is like as they try to understand some information. Situational disabilities are common, particularly on mobile devices. High contrast mode, closed captioning, and other assistive technology originally designed for people with permanent disabilities ends up helping everyone. Continuing our tour of context, we know that technology was an important piece of that as well. So we'll talk about assistive technology, or AT, the general term for tools that people with disabilities use to access digital media and digital content. Although as accessibility expert Sarah Hendren puts it, all technology is assistive technology. The monitor on which you view this presentation and the paper that I refer to while giving the presentation are supplementing our abilities to hear and to remember. The eyeglasses or contacts that a lot of us wear are supplementing our ability to see. Without my eyeglasses, I can't read the words on my paper or the screen. I can't make out the faces of anyone in this room unless I were to stand uncomfortably close to you. In the world of digital accessibility, the most common assistive technologies we work with on the software side are screen readers, voice recognition, and screen magnifiers, virtual screen magnifiers. On the hardware side, Keyboards, mice, and pointing devices are our most common pieces of assistive technology. Yep, your keyboard is a great piece of assistive technology. And I think in today's day of voice-activated interfaces, we need to think about headsets, microphones, and recording devices as also pieces of essential assistive technology. Now, when you think about the technological context of use in conjunction with information architecture, it can lead you to better design. Let's think about the humble alarm clock. You set it for a particular time, and it alerts you when that time arrives. But consider the context of use of that alarm clock, and remember the modes of interaction and perception from the Microsoft chart. Most of the time when an alarm clock goes off, we can't see it because it's dark and our eyes are closed. So the fact that it says, 6:30 a.m. on the screen is not particularly helpful to that mode of perception. It's a situational disability with seeing. So if the only thing the alarm does is light up or change colors, we might not even perceive it. We can add sound to the alarm, and that works for a lot of us. But some of us are heavy sleepers, this guy. Or maybe we're somewhere noisy during the day, which is a situational disability with hearing. We can add haptics, like vibration, to the alarm, and that will probably work when light and sound don't. Apple has done a good job with their alarm, integrating sight, sound, and touch on the watch at least, and the phone will also vibrate if you have it close enough that you feel that. Somebody might have a situational disability with touch, like nerve damage. So there's no perfect solutions, only trade-offs. My point is you need to consider multiple contexts of use and multiple technological constraints when designing. And ask yourself these questions. Where will the user be in what surroundings when they attempt to interact with the information? And remember that permanent, temporary, or situational disabilities might be a factor. Another time when context of use becomes incredibly important is when people are under stress. We know that stress eats up your cognitive resources. Your mind has severely reduced processing power when under stress. So it's vitally important that we present information to you in an easy to understand way. The same guideline applies to inclusive design. Now, stressors don't have to be life or death. We all have times when we're running late or when technology isn't working the way it should, like when you're trying to do a PowerPoint presentation. In these everyday moments, we appreciate good design and good information architecture. For example, with the help of the tech support gentleman, we were relatively easily able to figure out how to change the setting in PowerPoint to get it to fit on the screen, thanks to some pretty decent design. But we also curse the opposite. We curse bad design and bad information architecture when we're running late or we're under stress because we're in a hurry and we're already frustrated. We wish somebody would have thought about that when they were building the thing. And let's take the recommendation of Eric Meyer and Sarah Wachter-Becher and call these situations stress cases and not edge cases. An edge case, people say, well, it's an edge case. You can ignore it for now. Well, for now usually turns into forever, and you never address it. But a stress case, I think, is a little less likely to be ignored because all of us experience stress. Let's move on to the final part of the IA framework, content. As I put it in the slide title, content is still the king of the U in core, still the king of understanding, or understandable. An easy way to achieve understandability is to use plain language. Write the way you would speak to someone. If you have to use jargon, explain what it means. This is basic stuff. Equally important is the structure into which you place your content. Structure is what turns a mass of words and images into information. All of us learned structure in grade school when we made outlines for our 5-paragraph essays. You start with a topic. You break it into main points. Under each of these main points are supporting information. The same approach to structure is critically important for inclusive design. It's why designers and developers need to mark up their content with HTML. Now, I said at the beginning this isn't a how-to presentation, but I can't resist going into this one how-to because for digital accessibility and inclusive design, you have to use proper HTML titles and heading levels. These are your core structural and semantic elements. And they are semantic elements. They are not styling elements. That's what CSS is for. People with visual disabilities who use assistive technologies like screen readers depend upon good structure to navigate the information space. So do people without disabilities, which is why typography and visual design are important. Here's a good example of good structure. the World IA Day webpage for previous years and themes has a top navigation element that shows you where you are. It has a breadcrumb trail that further identifies the path that you took to get here. There's an H1 heading on the page, years and themes, which is the main topic. And each year underneath that heading is an H2 of the form year:theme. So it's consistent, it's simple, it's easy to follow, both for sighted users and for users on assistive technology. And this is what I mean by the importance of structured content. Here's one more example of the importance of structured content. This is a simplified web page with the landmarks on the page labeled. Landmarks are how many people with disabilities navigate a page when using assistive technology. Maybe they hear an announcement from a screen reader, or maybe they feel a different pattern of dots with a braille display, or maybe it's some other assistive technology that hasn't even been invented yet. The structural elements are also important for sighted users. After nearly 30 years of web design, we are intuitively familiar with this structure. You've got a header or a banner at the top. You've got a left-hand navigation. You've got an area in the middle with the main content, maybe some type of web application in it. You've got an area on the right with some complementary information, maybe a form or a search box. And then you've got a footer at the bottom, or it's called content info when you specify it for assistive technology. This is important because if you're using a screen reader like NVDA, non-visual desktop access, each of the landmark regions can be listed for you, and you can determine which ones are nested inside each other. So in this example, you've got a search form or a search box nested inside a form, which is nested inside that complementary landmark region. This is how you will navigate and sort of scan this page when you first come across it, in the same way that as a visual user, you would pick out the headings, the subheadings, the things that are in bold or that are offset in some way with white space. That structure is providing a framework that your content sits into, which is why I say that content is still the king. Let's look back at my crazy diagram, where I took the perceivable, operable, understandable, and robust, the poor mnemonic, and I connected them to the content, context, and users of the IA framework. So we want to make things perceivable, even to people with sensory impairments, certain types of users. We want to think about the context of use. What's the screen size they're on? What's the glare? What's the noise level? We want to think about how we have structured things. That kind of overlaps with other parts of the framework as well. But that's our content. It needs to be structured in a way that's perceivable. Operable. Again, context of use. Where are you? Can you operate under these conditions? And one of the situational disabilities that I didn't really talk about, but if you remember back to the chart, touch is both a perception mode and a mode of interaction. Well, if you're holding a baby in one hand and your car keys in the other, how are you going to interact with your touch screen? You're probably not. You're probably going to ask Siri instead. So think about that context of use to make things operable under a variety of conditions. Understandable. Here's where IA really plays a role. Navigation, structure, predictability, the way you organize your content, the way you allow people to find it. And finally, we want to have a robust underpinning under everything. We want to adhere to standards to ensure forwards compatibility with future technologies. This is a short presentation, and I've only scratched the surface of information architecture and inclusive design. I hope you were inspired to think about these topics as complementary to each other. So in summary, accessibility is the right thing to do and part of quality. Inclusive design means we put people first and we consider the range of human diversity when designing. One way you can do that is by making your information and content perceivable, operable, understandable, and robust. And for the best results, you can blend those poor mnemonics with the information architecture framework of content, context of use, and users. So that concludes my presentation. Thank you for listening. I will now take your questions.
It's not a question, but a comment. You mentioned how if you can't see or hear the alarm, but you can feel the vibration. There was also an invention, I don't know it well, but I just know I've heard of it. It was kind of interesting, is if you do a bad habit, it shocks you, which I thought was interesting too. I don't know how successful it is, but it was interesting.
Hopefully a light shock. Yes, over here.
What was it that you said to put on your website when you were speaking about the Google Spider?
Oh, so Google Spider really loves if you have short and unique titles on HTML title elements on every web page. And try to make them something meaningful as opposed to just homepage or web page. Because that's one of the ways that Google kind of decides how relevant your content is and how high it's going to be in the search rankings. Is there a good descriptive title on the page? It's also important for people with visual disabilities using assistive technology, because that's the first thing that will be announced to them when they land on the page, the title of the page. So if the title of the page is blank or basically meaningless, that's not really helpful. Like, where am I? And remember, people deep link into your site all the time. So they don't necessarily navigate their way there. They may just arrive at some page 5 levels deep. Where are they? Yes, in the back row.
Are there any tools that can help, like you did a site or you're working on some site, help you rank and see like how you're scoring when you see disability, or say, you're failing? Sure.
So good old Google has, in the developer tools, they have a variety of audits that you can do on your page. One of them is accessibility. One of them is for search engine ranking type stuff. There's a usability ranking. Again, these are good sort of general ways to get a sense. I wouldn't read too much into the numbers. Like, if you score a 67 and I score a 70, like, what does that really mean? Who knows? But if you score a 50 and somebody else scores an 80, you probably can start seeing a difference there. This tool listed at the bottom of the screen, Wave, is specifically for web accessibility evaluation. It's free. It's kind of the granddaddy of all accessibility tools. That is a good way to find some of the very common accessibility problems on a page. Keep in mind, any of these automated tools like Wave, or there's one that number 5 on the list, a few systems puts out called AXE, A-X-E, they can only detect about 25 to 30% of web content accessibility guideline violations, because the other 70 to 75% require some type of human judgment to know. Remember, they're guidelines, they're not rules. They're not necessarily zeros and ones that a computer can detect. I think there was a question over here, yep.
Have you ever conducted any usability testing on assistive technology device?
So the question was usability testing on assistive technology devices. Do you want to know if I used the device for testing or if I evaluated how good the device was?
The evaluation of someone with disability using it.
I have sadly not been able to get to that level of inclusive design maturity, right? I'd love to do UX research where we bring in people using assistive technology devices as part of our research. It's hard enough to recruit people, right? For a normal study, it's even 10 times as hard to recruit people because they may have a very specific setup. Maybe someone's in a wheelchair with a hard-mounted tablet and a fixed orientation, and might be very difficult for that person to get into my usability lab. So I would need to go to them, which in the corporate environment is not always easy. But there are organizations like, if I go back to the previous screen, like some of these, numbers 5, 6, and 7, and 8, some of these big accessibility consulting firms can link you up with people who are using assistive technology. The Cleveland Sight Center, Cleveland Center for Hearing and Speech, they also obviously have connections in the community. So that would be a great way to get FaceTime with, not Apple FaceTime, face-to-face time with people actually using these technologies. Now, some of them you can use for yourself, right? So everybody with an iPhone, you have one of the best screen readers on the market in your iPhone. It's called VoiceOver. Pro tip, make sure you know how to turn it off before you turn it on. But that is an excellent screen reader. You can certainly, and I would encourage you to play around with it yourself a little bit. If you're on a Windows machine, NVDA is a free screen reader. Actually, I think Microsoft now has a built-in one called Narrator, it's decent. Again, it's not the same as actually living with visual impairment every day, but if you close your eyes and try to navigate that way, you can get a flavor for it. Other questions? I thought there was one up here. Okay, here's my contact information. I love talking about this stuff. As I alluded to, I have a variety of other presentations that go more into the how-to around inclusive design and digital accessibility. I am the co-organizer of the Cleveland Accessibility Meetup. We are on Twitter under both I should put the @ sign, @A11YCLE and #A11YCLE. The A11Y is because the word accessibility is really long, and there's 11 letters between the A and the Y, so that's the shorthand for it. I'm also on the board of UXPA Cleveland, as are a couple other people in this room. If you're interested in UX, please come to those events. If you're interested in accessibility, please come to my meetups. Thank you very much, and I will not stand between you and lunch any longer.